What's up walkers? Today's game features Voltron, Zombie Tribal, Group Slug and Token Strategies. Who would you bet on? Leave your predictions in the comments below while I take 5 seconds to remind you that I release new Commander videos on the first Friday of the month. I also release new painting time-lapse videos every Friday, so make sure you're subscribed. And now we begin. Dan starts us off with Dragon Skull Summit and passes. I play a Forest and pass. Ryan plays an Arcane Sanctum and passes. Nathan plays a Swamp. He casts Gravecrawler and passes. Dan plays a Swamp. He casts Arcane Signet and passes. I play a Mountain. I cast Rampant Growth, getting a Forest and pass. Ryan plays a Command Tower. He casts Suppression Field and passes the turn. Nathan plays a Swamp. He casts Dread Malkin. He goes to combat and attacks Dan for 2 with the Gravecrawler. He passes the turn.
I'm going to play
your stuff, not his stuff.
Exactly.
Skafelkakellen.
Can you say that again for the camera?
Skafelkakellen.
Dan plays his German Sulphurous Springs. He casts his commander Mogis and passes the turn. I choose to take 2 from the Mogis trigger. I play a Forest and cast Farhaven Elf and get a Forest, passing the turn. Ryan takes 2 from the Mogis trigger. He plays an island and then casts Karmic Justice and passes.
Yeah.
Accidentally.
Accidentally on purpose.
And then I recast it. Just went back home.
He chose to go to sleep.
He never sleeps. He just
Pass
rolls.
the turn.
He's always crawling. He's a grave crawler.
Crawling on.
Dan plays a Mountain. He casts Rakdos Signet and then Dreamstealer. He passes the turn. I take 2 from the Mogis trigger and play a Forest. I cast Krenko, Tin Street Kingpin. I then cast Pride Malkin and put the +1 counter on Krenko. I pass the turn. Ryan takes 2 from the Mogis trigger. He plays a Plains and he casts Greater Oromancy and passes. Nathan sacks Gravecrawler to the Mogis trigger.
Yeah, got the land.
Is that what you needed?
Yeah, because I have to keep playing Gravecrawler. So it's costing me extra time.
He casts Cemetery Reaper and passes. Dan plays a Swamp. He casts Painful Quandary. He moves to combat and swings Dreamstealer at Ryan. Ryan responds by exiling it with Divine Smite. He loses 5 life to the Quandary trigger, and the Dreamstealer is smitten. Dan passes the turn.
Now recast Gravecrawler every fucking turn.
I will.
And then you have to discard. Actually, you probably want to discard cards then.
I will. Thank you, Dan.
I take 2 from the Mogis trigger. I cast my commander Grumgully and lose 5 life to the Quandary trigger. I then cast Evolution Sage, who enters with a +1 counter from Grumgully, and I lose another 5 life. I then play a Forest and Proliferate, adding another counter to the Evolution Sage and Krenko. I move to combat and swing Krenko at Dan, adding another counter to him and making 4 Goblin tokens, who all enter with a +1 counter on them. Dan takes 4 and I pass the turn. Ryan takes 2 from the Mogis trigger. He plays Forsaken Sanctuary. He casts a copy enchantment and chooses for it to become a copy of Painful Quandary. He discards a Swamp to Dan's Painful Quandary trigger and passes.
Now he's not recasting it.
Nathan takes 2 from the Mogis trigger. He casts Chemist's Insight. He discards Relentless Dead to the first trigger and loses 5 from the second. He moves to combat and swings Gravecrawler, Dread Malkin and Cemetery Reaper, all at Ryan for 7 damage, and Nathan passes the turn. Thank you so much for watching this far, you legend. Let us know your thoughts on the game, editing and energy in the comments. Dan plays a Mountain. He casts Gruldraz's Spectre and discards Bloodhusk Ritualist to Ryan's Painful Quandary. Dan passes the turn. I take 2 from the Mogis trigger. Nathan agrees not to attack me for a turn or mess with my board in exchange for killing Ryan. I move to combat and send all the boys at Ryan. Krenko gets another counter and makes 6 more goblins with +1 counters. Ryan takes 25 and dies. He reveals he had a clever impersonator in hand to create yet another painful quandary next turn. I pass the turn. Nathan takes 2 from the Mogis trigger. He casts Sir Conrad and discards Diagraph Captain to the quandary trigger. Dan and I take 1 from Sir Conrad, but this was a mistake because Sir Conrad was still on the stack when Nathan discarded. He moves to combat and swings Dreadmalkin at Dan for 2. He passes the turn. Dan casts Nightshade Harvester. He then casts Abyssal Spectre. He moves to combat and swings Gruldraz's Spectre at me. I take 2 and discard Iridescent Hornbeetle. Dan passes the turn. I sacrifice Farhaven Elf to the Mogis trigger. Dan and I each take 1 from Sir Conrad. I play a mountain, losing 1 life to the Nightshade Harvester trigger, and I proliferate all my +1 counters and consolidate my goblin tokens. I move to combat and swing all the 3/3 trample goblin tokens at Dan, and I swing Krenko at Nathan. Krenko gets a counter and makes 7 more goblins. Sir Conrad and Cemetery Reaper block Krenko, and Mogis blocks a goblin token. The goblin token, Cemetery Reaper and Sir Conrad die, but we miss that Krenko should have died from combat. Dan takes 24 combat damage, and Dan and I each take 3 from Sir Conrad triggers. I pass the turn. Nathan sacrifices the Gravecrawler to the Mogis trigger. He plays a swamp and loses 1 life to the Harvester. He casts Living Death. He discards Vizier of the Scorpion to the Quandary trigger. Dan returns Bloodhusk Ritualist. I return Farhaven Elf and Iridescent Hornbeetle, while Nathan returns Vizier, Relentless Dead, Diagraph Captain, Cemetery Reaper, Sir Conrad and Gravecrawler. He also gets an amass token from the Vizier. He passes the turn. Dan recasts Mogis and passes the turn. I take 2 from the Mogis trigger. I play a mountain. I recast Grumgully and discard Beast Within to Painful Quandary. I then cast Tendershoot Dryad and lose 5 life to the Quandary as I'm out of cards. I pass the turn. In my end step, the Hornbeetle makes me an insect token, represented here by a Mere token, and the Dryad makes a Saproling in Nathan's upkeep. Nathan sacrifices the zombie army to the Mogis trigger. Dan and I take 1 from Sir Conrad and lose 1 life from the Diagraph Captain. He moves to combat and swings it all at me. Dan and I are very dead regardless of how I block, so Nathan wins. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share on the socials. I'll see you next time.
You've got the Demir there, haven't you? I'll go for something else.
Rakdos.
You want to go Rakdos?
No, no one wants you to
I'll
go
go Rakdos then. You asked me to.
No, I said that's colours you could go.
Well, that's the colours you wanted, so that's the colours I'm in. If I win, it's Nathan's fault.